And breaking in just the last half an hour, the New York Times reporting that two top Trump donors paid Rick Gates, a former deputy campaign chairman for Donald Trump, for inside access to the administration, even as Gates was drawing scrutiny from Robert Mueller. Their financial arrangement, not previously reported before this afternoon, was emblematic of the way a small circle of Mr. Trump's associates at the beginning of his presidency aggressively marketed their administration access to well-paying clients, and sheds light on the activities of Mr. Gates, who has emerged as a key figure in the investigation of the special counsel Robert S. Mueller. One of the reporters with a byline on that story, Ken Vogel, joins us now from the New York Times. So, Ken, it's a fascinating read. It goes deep into some of the big geopolitical cross currents between the UAE and Qatar, and it goes into one of the sort of layers that the special counsel has peeled off, and that's the practice of selling access to this White House and this president. Can you pull that thread through for us?
Yeah, absolutely, Nicole. And one of the things that you just alluded to, that these payments came even as Rick Gates was emerging as a key figure in Mueller's investigation and the investigation of congressional committees looking into connections between Trump and Russia, is notable because in past administrations, as you know, whenever there was someone who was kind of a hanger-on or even an insider who was surrounded by sort of a whiff of scandal, the White House and the administration, the people around the president went to great lengths to keep that person away from the inner circle. And here you have Rick Gates not only continuing to have access, but selling his access to other people who presumably would have their own access here, which raises a second question here about why Elliot Broidy and Tom Barrack would be paying Rick Gates when they have their own access. Certainly some of the Trump insiders who we talked to thought that maybe they were trying to buck up Rick Gates to give him some sense that he would have financial stability that could be used to pay for mounting legal bills if he were to be indicted, which he ultimately was, so that he might not feel the same inclination to flip, which of course he ultimately did. So a lot of things going on here in this story, but certainly a puzzling relationship between Rick Gates and these two major donors to Trump.
I've stacked the table with lawyers to explain some of this to me, but let me pull out a couple of things that strike me as really odd. You talked about a whiff of scandal. Paul Manafort was covered in a stench of dirty business. He did a book of dirty business that any Republican living or working in Washington, D.C. has known about for decades. So why was there any doubt that Gates, I mean, it would seem preordained that Gates would get ensnared in pretty grave legal trouble by the time Manafort was under that kind of scrutiny?
Yeah, that's right. And there were people who were around the president who did try to keep Rick Gates away. But one of the things that Rick Gates had going for him that allowed him to continue to have at least some access to the administration was the blessing, or the perceived blessing, of Tom Barrack, one of Donald Trump's actual friends and a major donor who was the chair of the inaugural committee for which Rick Gates worked. Tom Barrack actually had Rick Gates open an office in D.C. for Barrack's firm. So this was seen as something that was not so easy to ignore by even folks around Trump who thought better of having Rick Gates with this looming cloud of scandal hanging over him around the White House and around the administration. And
Rick Gates, not a household name the way some of these other characters are, but he's now working for Bob Mueller. He's now on Team America, telling Bob Mueller and his investigators everything they want to know about the Trump campaign. Any concern about the amount of time Rick Gates lasted after Manafort was off the scene? He was in and out of this White House long after Donald Trump was inaugurated. He was in and around some key people and places who were also of interest to Robert Mueller. Is there anything about those intersections between Gates and folks in the White House and the folks that you write about today that creates more anxiety for people now that he's a cooperating witness in the Mueller probe?
Yeah, absolutely. And you raise a valid point. Manafort was pushed out, despite the fact that what he was pushed out over, which was his work in Ukraine for pro-Russian oligarchs and officials there, was something that Rick Gates was his right-hand man on that work for more than a decade before the presidential campaign started. So you would think that if there was concern about what Manafort was doing in the interest of investigators in it, that same concern would extend to Rick Gates. But as you mentioned, Manafort was pushed out. Rick Gates remained around not just on the campaign through Election Day, but worked on the inaugural committee, basically was the right-hand man of Tom Barrack running the inaugural committee, and was the chair, or was an official at the pro-Trump super PAC early in the administration. So he continued to hang around even as the same concerns that did steer the Trump folks away from Paul Manafort applied to him as well.
Paul Butler, would you be surprised if the special counsel didn't want to just chit-chat with people like Mr. Barrack? And I think Elliot Broidy is already known to be of interest to Mueller. But it seems like the value of someone like Gates, who was Manafort's deputy, who was around during the campaign, who was around during the presidency, is that, one, he's agreed to cooperate. He's agreed to, I guess, in exchange for leniency at sentencing, tell them everything they want to know. But two, his tentacles really cross the government and the business webs that are very much of interest to this investigation.
That's right. So I expect that Rick Gates will be the star witness at Paul Manafort's trial. But again, Paul Manafort's trial really doesn't have anything to do with collusion and obstruction of justice, which are the basis of the Mueller probe. So this may be about mission creep, but I think it's also about collusion and obstruction of justice. I don't think that Bob Mueller would be putting his star prosecutors on this case, spending all of these resources if we're only about Paul Manafort not registering as a lobbyist for Ukraine.
Right, for the FAR violations. It's not Mueller's mission.
Yeah, so I think he's trying to get to Manafort. Again, Manafort has not so far indicated that he wants to make a deal. Chuck, I don't know about you, but I had lots of cases that went to the day before trial, and then defendant decides he's going to plead. So it's not too late for that to happen.
What do you think about this idea of more and more people sort of getting sucked into the vortex of this investigation?
Well, it's almost inevitable. This is a big, sprawling case, right? I mean, in fact, it's all over the world in a sense.
Right.
And so it's not unusual to find, that this pond has many ripples. I also agree with Paul. I think he's exactly right. I've had the same experience, Nicole. A lot of times folks get right up to the precipice and end up pleading guilty. And there's a reason for that, and Paul knows it as well as anyone. They file what we call dispositive motions. Let me explain that. They file a motion to suppress evidence. If they win that, the government's case could be in a lot of trouble, and the government may lose its leverage. If they lose that, as Mr. Manafort has done, they may have to recalculate what they're going to do next. I've even seen people plead in the middle of trial. It wouldn't be that unusual, Paul.
Yeah, and so the really tough issue for Bob Mueller will be if he uncovers criminality by Donald Trump or the Trump organization that doesn't have anything to do with collusion or obstruction, what he does with that evidence.
And it's in his mandate from Rod Rosenstein to investigate all crimes uncovered in the investigation of collusion and obstruction. It's a good time to be a lawyer.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.